Cordite and hot steel. That's the smell in Feldwebel Erwin Kessler's turret when the muzzle flash comes from the tree line to his left. Kessler is a Panther gunner, and a good one, 26 years old, with 3 knocked-out Shermans painted on his gun barrel. He knows the drill by heart. See the flash, call the traverse, put the crosshair where the enemy is. His hand is already on the traverse wheel before his brain finishes the thought. The turret swings. The optics settle on the spot in the hedgerow where the flame bloomed a half-second ago, and there is nothing there. No tank, no smoke pillar, no engine note, only a bent gap in the brush and the memory of a shape that has already reversed out of sight and gone. Whatever killed the Panther 50 meters to his right is not where it fired from. It is somewhere he cannot see yet, and by the time he finds it, it will have moved again. The thing that ghosted him weighed 19 tons and was called the M18 Hellcat, and it could do 55 miles an hour on a road, which no German tank on the Western Front could come close to matching. That's the riddle of this whole story. German tank crews in the autumn of 1944, professionals, veterans, men crewing the finest heavy armor the war produced, started refusing to run certain roads after one American Tank Destroyer Battalion set up shop. Not because the American vehicle was tougher. It wasn't. A Hellcat had armor you could defeat with a heavy machine gun in the right spot. Its crew rode into battle in a vehicle that could be opened like a ration tin. On paper, the Panther should have eaten it alive. Instead, the Panthers started taking the long way around. That contradiction is the reason this channel exists. The moments where the enemy's own behavior, his detours, and his fear and his after-action reports tells you something the recruiting posters never would. If you want more of these, the ones the war movies are too lazy to touch, a like and a subscribe keep them coming, and drop a comment with the vehicle you want dismantled next. Now, back to the road. The battalion was the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, though the pattern I'm describing repeats across several of them. And the man in this particular scene is a stand-in for a dozen documented gunners who live the same confusion. Kessler is my reconstruction, drawn from the way German crews describe the experience in interrogation, and in the letters censors read before they burned. The Hellcat crews were not. They were real, they were young, and their whole method was built on a single idea the Germans found almost impossible to plan against: shoot from a place. Leave that place immediately. The doctrine had an ugly name, shoot and scoot, and it worked because the vehicle was fast enough to make the scoot part real. A Panther that fired and stayed put was a Panther betting its crew that nobody had seen the flash. A Hellcat that fired and stayed put was a dead Hellcat, and its crews knew it, so they never did. One German officer, interrogated after the fighting in Lorraine, described the American tank destroyers with a word his interrogator wrote down carefully. He called them ghosts, not fast, not clever, ghosts. His men would report a gun position, call in artillery on it, and hit empty grass. That word is his, recorded in the report, not something I've dressed up for effect. When a professional soldier reaches past the technical vocabulary he was trained to use and grabs for something out of a campfire story, that tells you the machine has broken something in how he understands the battlefield. Here is what Kessler cannot know from inside his turret. The American who just killed his wingman is already 300 meters down a farm track, engine screaming, reloading on the move, hunting for the next flash of a Panther that thinks it's hidden. The hunter has become the hunted, and the whole reversal took under 10 seconds. To understand how a 19-ton vehicle with paper armor turned Germany's best armor into road-shy prey, we have to go back to a decision the U.S. Army made years earlier, and an argument almost nobody won. Mid-September 1944, and the trains are still moving east of the Moselle. Panzer Brigade 113 came off those trains near Nancy, with the paint barely cured on its Panthers. This was one of Hitler's pet formations. The Panzer Brigade stood up that autumn on his personal insistence, built around fresh tanks and green crews, and the idea that a sharp armored fist could throw the Americans back across the river. The brigade had roughly 90 Panthers and Panzer IVs on its books. The men crewing them believed, with some justification, that they were driving the best tank on the battlefield. They were not wrong about the tank. A Panther's long 75 could punch through a Sherman's front at ranges where the Sherman's gun did nothing but scratch paint. The frontal armor was sloped and thick and had ruined a lot of American afternoons in Normandy. If you handed a German tank commander a list of what he might meet outside Nancy and asked him which fights he feared, the tank versus tank fight was near the bottom. He had won that fight all summer. The brigade's confidence rested on something specific. German doctrine treated the tank as the answer to the tank. You killed armor, or with a dug-in anti-tank gun that you could see and range and respect. The whole mental model assumed the enemy's tank killer was itself a tank, or something like one, that would stand and trade. Something that fought the way you fought. The orders were straightforward. Cross the American bridgehead over the Moselle south of Nancy, roll up the flank, retake the ground, restore the line. Ambitious for the fuel and the crews on hand, but not insane on paper. The Americans in the way were the 4th Armored Division, and screening them, the tank destroyers of the 604th and the units near them. The brigade knew the 4th Armored was out there. What it did not know, what nobody had briefed into those green crews, was the specific nature of the thing that would be waiting in the fog. Fog is the detail everyone leaves out. The mornings around Arracourt in mid-September came in thick, visibility down to a couple of 100 meters, and that fog did two things at once. It stripped the Americans of the air power that had flayed German armor all summer, which sounds like a gift to the brigade. And it pulled every fight down to knife range, 200 meters, 300, distances where the Panthers' beautiful long-range gun advantage evaporated, and where a lighter, faster vehicle that knew the ground could get onto a flank before anyone saw it coming. The weather that grounded the Jabos also handed the Hellcat the exact conditions it was built to exploit. The brigade rolled into it, reading the fog as cover. General Hasso von Manteuffel would later have opinions about how the Panzer brigades were misused that autumn, thrown in piecemeal, undertrained, without the reconnaissance that armor needs to fight well. He commanded the larger effort in the region, and he was not sentimental about it in his post-war writing. The crews had courage and equipment. What they lacked was the thing that keeps armor alive, which is knowing what is in front of you before it knows about you. Two vehicles were rolling toward each other in that fog, and nothing about them matched. On one side, a Panther, superb gun, heavy glacis, a crew trained to fight the tank duel and win it. On the other, a 19-ton open-topped vehicle with armor a man could defeat with the right machine gun, crewed by Americans who had no intention whatsoever of fighting a tank duel and every intention of shooting from a flank and vanishing before the turret could come around. The brigade expected to meet its own reflection, another tank, fighting by the rules it understood. It was about to meet something that had thrown the rules out on purpose and had been designed, argued over, and built specifically to refuse the fight the Germans were good at. That refusal came from a decision made in Washington and Fort Meade years earlier by a man most of the U.S. Army had come to dislike over an idea most of the Army thought was wrong. To understand what happened in the fog, you have to understand the argument that put the Hellcat there. The man was Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Bruce, and the idea he championed was one the rest of the Army mostly hated. Bruce ran the Tank Destroyer Center at Camp Hood, and his conviction was simple to the point of being reckless. Tanks should not fight tanks. Tanks should break through and exploit, and the killing of enemy armor should be handed to a separate, specialized force built for that one job. His motto for the branch was seek, strike, destroy, and he meant every ugly word of it. The tank destroyer would not be a tank. It would be a gun on a fast, light chassis, an open turret for visibility, speed traded for armor on purpose. The whole philosophy read like heresy to men who wanted thicker plate and a roof over their heads. Bruce fought his own army over it for 2 years, and he mostly lost the argument even as his vehicles were winning fights in the field. The design that came out of the fight was the M18, and it was a strange animal, 19 tons. A radial aircraft-type engine driving through a torsion bar suspension, geared for a road speed that touched 60 miles an hour on a good surface, which made it the fastest tracked combat vehicle any nation fielded in the entire war. Nothing German came close. Nothing British or Soviet either. The 76mm gun could kill a Panther from the flank all day, and could hurt one from the front under the right conditions, and the turret slewed fast because the whole vehicle was built around getting the gun onto a target and then getting the vehicle out of the reply. The armor was almost an afterthought, half an inch in places, open on top, useless against anything heavier than shell splinters and machine gun fire. A crewman who took a direct hit was in serious trouble. A crewman who was never where the enemy shot was in no trouble at all. The entire vehicle was a bet that the second man would outnumber the first. That bet had a name in the field manuals, and the doctrine writers were blunt about it. The tank destroyer was to fight from ambush and from the flank, hidden until it fired, and it was never to slug it out from the front. Speed was the armor. A gun you cannot find is a gun you cannot kill. The British had reached for something adjacent in the Western Desert 2 years earlier, though from the opposite direction. They had learned the hard way, at places like Gazala, that charging armor headlong into a screen of dug-in German anti-tank guns got tanks slaughtered in job lots. The German 88 and the towed 50mm guns, sighted on reverse slopes and camouflaged, chewed up British squadrons that came on expecting a fair tank fight and found instead an invisible gun line. The lesson the British took was defensive. Respect the hidden gun, don't ride onto it. The Americans took the same underlying truth and made it a machine that could move. Put the hidden gun on 60-mile-an-hour tracks, let it fire and relocate before the counter shot arrives, and you have turned a defensive tactic into a hunting one. Which brings us back to the fog outside Nancy, where a brigade trained to win the frontal duel was rolling toward men who had been drilled and equipped never to give them one. The irony is one Bruce probably never savored properly. His branch was controversial, underloved, and after the war it was disbanded fast. The doctrine judged a partial failure because the pure tank versus tank ambush role never dominated the way he promised. Historians have spent decades arguing the tank destroyer concept was flawed. Maybe, but flawed concepts don't make veteran enemy crews reroute their advance. The men in the Panthers didn't read the doctrine debates. They only knew that a certain kind of American vehicle appeared, killed from an angle, and was gone before the turret came around, and that the smart move was to not be on the road where it hunted. Colonel Bruce wanted his killers built light and fast and mean, and the Army gave him grief for it at every step. Outside Nancy, in the fog, 90 German tanks were about to demonstrate exactly what he had been arguing for. They just didn't know. They were about to become the evidence. 0400 hours, September 19th, and the ground crews of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion cannot see their own hands past the wrist. The fog came up off the Lorraine plateau overnight and settled like wet wool. It is the kind of fog that beads on gun barrels and soaks through field jackets and swallows sound, so that a man hears an engine and cannot tell you if it is 50 meters off or 500. The 704th was the Tank Destroyer Battalion attached to the 4th Armored, and its Hellcats were spread in penny packets across the low rolling farmland around Arracourt, hull down, where they could be, tucked into folds and behind hedgerows, waiting. Nobody on the American side planned this weather. They just understood, faster than the enemy did, what it was worth. Think about what fog does to a gun sight. The Panther's advantage was reach. Its optics were superb. Its long 75 could find a target at 2,000 meters and kill it at 1,500. And every tactical habit the German crews owned was built to fight at those distances, to see first and shoot first across open ground. Fog deletes all of it. When you cannot see past 200 meters, the finest telescopic sight in the world shows you the same gray nothing as the cheapest. The German advantage did not lose a fight that morning. It simply stopped existing, erased by the weather before the first round went downrange, and the same fog handed the Americans exactly the range they wanted. The Hellcat was never built to trade shots at 2,000 meters. It was built to sit still and quiet in a fold of ground, let armor blunder past at knife range, and put a 76 into the thin side plate from an angle where even a Panther's flank gives up and burns. Fog was the tank destroyer's natural weather. It closed the distance for free while hiding the ambusher, and it robbed the German crews of the one thing that made a Panther a Panther. The vehicle the Germans feared least, on the morning they should have feared it most, had just been handed the perfect room to work in. Sergeants and lieutenants ran the fight that came, not generals. The command net was thin, the visibility was worse, and the men in the individual Hellcats made their own decisions in the murk, when to fire, when to displace, which gray shape was worth a round. This is the part the doctrine got right and the critics forget. Bruce built a vehicle that let a 19-year-old commander back it out of a firing position and be 400 meters gone before the return shot cracked through the fog into empty grass. The 704th did not need to see the whole battlefield. Each crew needed to see its own 200 meters and to trust that the throttle would do the rest. Colonel Creighton Abrams was somewhere in that soup with the 4th Armored's tanks, the same Abrams who would give his name to an American tank a generation later, and even he could not have told you the shape of the fight in real time. Nobody could. The after-action report stitched it together afterward from a dozen partial views, and they do not fully agree on sequence or time. The fog got into the record the way it got into everything. What the Germans rolled into, they could not read. Panzer Brigade 113 came on through the mist expecting cover for its advance, reading the gray as a blanket that hid them from the dreaded American fighter bombers, and in a sense it was. The Jabos stayed grounded, but the fog that grounded the aircraft also delivered the brigade, tank by tank, into the 200-meter world, where its guns meant nothing, and where a faster, lighter, uglier machine was already sitting still and waiting for an engine note to resolve into a target. The stage was set with a cruel neatness. Superb German optics were blinded, and a green German crew stayed confident, while an American vehicle that only worked at close range had been given close range for free. Every advantage the brigade carried onto that plateau had quietly been switched off in the dark, and the first the Germans would learn of it was the flash from a flank they never checked. B Company's lead Hellcat fires first, and the round crosses maybe 150 meters of fog before it hits. The gunner never saw a whole tank. He saw the flat gray slab of a hull side, sliding left to right across his sight, close enough that the fog had thinned to a smear rather than a wall, and he laid the reticle on the middle of it and fired. 76 millimeters of armor-piercing shot does not announce itself, it arrives. The Panther on the receiving end was still moving, its turret still trained forward along the axis of the road, its commander still reading the mist ahead for the threat he expected to come from the front. The shot went into the side, through the thin flank plate where a Panther keeps its ammunition and its fuel, and the tank stopped being a tank. Watch what happens to the turret. A Panther's turret traverses slowly, a hydraulic drive geared for precision at long range rather than speed at knife range, and the crew commander has to see a target, call it, and wait while the gunner cranks the gun around. That whole sequence assumes seconds the crew did not have. The Hellcat had already fired before the German commander registered a shape worth turning for. By the time the traverse motor could have swung the long 75 toward the muzzle flash on the flank, the second Panther in the column was catching a round of its own. B Company was firing into the side of a moving line, and a moving line presents nothing but flanks. 3 Panthers burned in the space of a couple of minutes. The after-action account is dry about it, the way those reports always are, listing vehicles knocked out without much interest in what that looked like from inside. What it looked like from inside was a hull filling with pressure and light, the ready rounds cooking, hatches that a man had a second or two to reach or did not. A Panther that takes a flank penetration into the ammunition does not smolder. It detonates, the turret sometimes lifting on the blast, and the crew that survives comes out burned and half deaf and unable to tell anyone where the shot came from. That is what stays with you. Not one of the 3 killed the vehicle that killed it. They died without a return shot, without a target, without ever resolving the gray shape in the fog into something they could shoot back at. A Panther crew, veterans some of them, driving the tank they had every right to trust, and the fight was decided before their turret had moved 10 degrees. Feldwebel Kessler, whose turret we started inside, was living the German half of this exact arithmetic somewhere in the same murk. A good gunner, 3 Shermans on his barrel, and none of that skill worth a thing against a flash from a tree line he had no reason to be watching. The men in B Company were not better tankers than the Germans they killed. They were in a better position, in a better vehicle for that position, doing the one thing their machine was built to do. Bruce's whole heretical argument, the seek and strike and destroy of it, reduced down to 150 meters of fog and a turret that could not turn fast enough. Then the Hellcats moved. This is the part that separated the M18 from every towed gun and every slower tank destroyer that ever fought from ambush. The killing was only half the doctrine. The other half was leaving. A crew that fired 3 rounds and stayed put was a crew waiting to be found, and even a blinded Panther can shoot at a muzzle flash if the flash stays in one place long enough. B Company's vehicles fired and rolled, backing out of their firing positions and repositioning through folds in the ground, so that when the surviving Germans did orient on the threat, they oriented on empty grass where the smell of burnt powder still hung. The engine note the Americans made was a departing one. 3 Panthers on the field near Leasy, hulls open to the fog, crews dead or scattered, and the men who did it already 200 meters away and looking for the next shape. The brigade had lost its first tanks of the morning to an enemy it never saw and could not find. An enemy it did not yet understand. It was fighting. The gray road ahead still looked like cover. It was not. By 0540, the fight has become a rhythm, and the rhythm belongs to the Americans. One exchange on the ridge east of Arracourt ran like this, stitched from the after-action reports and the crews who told it later. A Hellcat sits in a fold, engine idling low, and a Panther grinds up out of the mist 40 meters off its flank. The gunner fires. The round goes home, and the Panther lights. The driver is already reversing before the shell case hits the mat, torsion bars soaking up the ground as the vehicle backs down the reverse slope, and by the time a second German tank in the column has swung its long gun toward the flash, the Hellcat is not there. It is 150 meters right, climbing a different fold, and it fires again from a bearing the Germans are not covering. Shoot, reverse, vanish, reappear where no gun is pointed. The Germans could not solve it because the problem kept moving. A tank fight, in the doctrine both sides learned, is supposed to resolve into a line facing a line, guns front, the stronger armor and the better optics telling over time. That is the fight the Panther was built to win and would have won. But you cannot form a line against an enemy who fires from your 4 o'clock, is gone before you traverse, and fires next from your 8. Every time a German commander called a threat bearing and cranked his turret onto it. The threat had already relocated, and the act of turning toward the last muzzle flash presented his own flank to the next one. The 75 was a magnificent gun aimed that morning at empty grass. The brigade kept swinging at where the Hellcat had been. This is the exact thing Bruce drew on a chalkboard at Camp Hood, and the exact thing his critics said would never survive contact. Read the German casualty arithmetic, and it stops being abstract. Panzer Brigade 113 came onto the plateau with a fighting strength the reports put in the neighborhood of 100 armored vehicles across the Arracourt battles. Over these days, it was gutted. Tank after tank, killed from the flank, from ambush, by a battalion that traded almost nothing for it. The 704th and the 4th Armored's own Shermans, working the same murk. The Panther cost more to build than the machine that killed it, carried a better gun than the machine that killed it. Wore armor. The machine that killed it could not have hoped to match in a frontal duel. None of that entered the equation. The equation was position and speed, and the Americans owned both. There is one man I keep coming back to. His name is not in the file, and that is the point. Somewhere in that fog, a German loader felt his tank take a flank hit and got out through a hatch with his hands and face burning, and he came to rest in a wet Lorraine beet field with the sound gone out of one ear, and what he could tell his interrogators afterward amounted to nothing. He never saw it. He heard an engine that might have been friendly, and then his tank was full of light. The report notes crews unable to identify the direction of fire. That is a clean sentence for a filthy thing. Men died at close range in the dark, not knowing which way to be afraid. That was the whole verdict, and it was written in burning fuel and unanswered rounds. By full light the fog began to lift, and with it went the American edge, because a Hellcat caught in the open by a Panther at 1,000 meters is a dead Hellcat, and every man in the 704th knew it. The battalion took losses too on the days that followed, when the weather turned honest and the range opened back up. Speed is only armor, while the enemy cannot see you. But the morning had already done its work. On the ground near Lisi and Arracourt lay the wrecks of tanks that should, by every table of armor and gun and optics, have won, and had instead been shot to pieces by a vehicle their crews had been taught to hold in contempt. The road east was littered with the proof. The survivors had started quietly to think about another way around. Major General Manton Eddy tallied the wreckage after the fact, and the number he read back was one that no armor table on either side would have predicted. 15 Panthers destroyed, 3 Hellcats lost. That was the exchange on the morning of the 19th around Arracourt, and the ratio is not a rounding error or a proud man's inflation. It is what the after-action reports of the 704th carried forward, corroborated by the 4th Armored's own accounting. 5 German tanks for every American one, and the American one, a thin-skinned open-top machine, a third of the Panther's price. The men who built the Doctrine could not have drawn a cleaner proof if they had staged it. Look at what the number does to the German story. Panzer Brigade 113 had rolled off the trains as a fresh formation, with a mission that assumed it could push armor through Lorraine and take Nancy from the flank. By midday, it was a formation that could no longer do the thing it existed to do. Tanks it could not replace, crews it could not replace, gone in a fog that lifted before most of them ever fired an aimed round. The brigade did not lose a battle of maneuver. It was disassembled, tank by tank, from angles it never covered. What stays with me is how little the survivors could tell anyone. The interrogation summaries and the German accounts that filtered up afterward come back again and again to the same complaint, and it is not about American armor or American gunnery. It is about not being able to find the enemy. Crews reported taking fire from tank destroyers they never saw, from positions that were empty by the time a turret came around, and from a direction that changed with every round. One German officer's account, paraphrased in the reporting, amounts to an admission that his men could not fix the American vehicles long enough to engage them. Read it plainly, and it is a professional soldier confessing that he was beaten by a problem he could not locate. That confession is the whole payoff of Bruce's argument, because a Panther crew could accept being outgunned. That is a fair fight lost, and soldiers make peace with fair fights. What the 704th handed them was worse and stranger. A fight in which their gun, their optics, their armor, every advantage stamped into the vehicle, simply never came into play. You cannot aim a superb 75 at a muzzle flash that is already gone. You cannot angle 60 degrees of frontal armor toward a shot coming into your side. The Germans were not outfought in the terms they understood fighting. They were removed from a fight they thought they were in. 15 for 3, and the 3 mattered too. Those 3 Hellcat crews died in the same fog. Some of them caught when a Panther did get a shot off, or when the murk thinned at the wrong second, and an open-topped hull took a burst it could not survive. The M18 protected nobody who got unlucky. A tank destroyer that trades its armor for speed is a coffin the moment the enemy sees it first. And 3 American crews learned that on the same field where 15 German crews learned the opposite lesson. The doctrine worked. It was not bloodless. Bruce's machine bought its 5-to-1 with men who had no roof over their heads and knew it every time they idled in a fold, waiting for an engine note. There is a detail in the reporting I keep returning to. A German survivor, describing the sound, said the American tanks seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, a noise of engines that came from all sides of the mist at once. He was not describing many vehicles. He was describing a few vehicles moving fast, firing, and relocating faster than his ear could build a map. The fog that was supposed to be his cover had become the medium in which a smaller enemy multiplied. By the time the tally was written up, the brigade east of Arracourt had stopped thinking about Nancy. The offensive that Panzer Brigade 113 had been committed to support was already coming apart, and its armor was scattered across the plateau in burnt clusters that told the same story from every angle of penetration. The road the brigade had meant to own now belonged to the machine it had been taught to despise. "Take that road again," the driver said, "and you take it without me." The words are paraphrased out of the German accounts, but the sentiment is documented, and it hardened fast. Within days of the 19th, the movement orders coming down to what was left of Panzer Brigade 113, and to the units that shared the plateau with it, started bending around the low ground east of Arracourt rather than through it, not because a staff officer drew a red line on a map and forbade it, because tank crews, the men who actually had to sit in the hull and drive the route, had begun to treat certain stretches of open Lorraine road as places you did not go if there was any other way to go. The detour was the verdict, and the Germans wrote it with their tracks. Look at what that costs an army. A Panther burns fuel the Reich could not spare, and every extra kilometer of a route chosen for safety instead of speed is fuel spent buying distance from a fear. Late September of 1944, and the German fuel situation was already a slow strangulation. Tanks abandoned intact because the jerry cans behind them were empty. To choose the long way around is to spend the one thing you cannot replace in order to avoid a battalion of open-top machines, a third, the weight of your own tank. That is what the 704th had done to them. It had not destroyed every tank. It had made the surviving crews spend fuel to avoid meeting it. The fog is the thing I keep coming back to. For 200 years, an army caught in fog considered itself unlucky, and an army hidden by it considered itself blessed, and both assumptions ran one direction. The British at Waterloo cursed the morning mist that hid the French forming up. Every commander who ever moved under cover of weather understood cover as protection. What happened on the Lorraine Plateau inverted that. The mist that should have shielded 100 German tanks became the exact medium a fast, quiet, close-range killer needed, and the crews learned it in the worst possible way, one flank penetration at a time. Which returns us to the road, because a crew that has learned fog is no longer its friend has lost something more than tanks. It has lost the ability to trust the weather, the ground, the cover, the whole set of instincts that keeps a tanker alive. You can hear it in the smell they carried afterward. A man who survived a Panther burning does not forget the specific stink of it, the sweetness of cordite gone over into something worse, hydraulic fluid and paint, and the fuel, and the things fuel touches. And that smell rode home with every survivor who climbed out of a hull near Lizy and walked back through the beet fields with one ear ringing. Those men rejoined their units. They talked. A brigade does not need a written order to change its behavior when the crews who lived through the 19th are sitting in the mess, telling the crews who did not exactly what a flank hit from nowhere does to a Panther that cost more than the house any of them grew up in. The road east of Arracourt got its reputation the way roads always do, by word of mouth from the men who survived it. And here is the part that closes the circle. The whole German plan had been to take Nancy, to push armor through this ground and turn the American flank. And the road through the low country was the fast way to do it. By the end of September, that road belonged, in the only sense that matters on a battlefield, to a machine the German army had studied, measured, outgunned on paper, and been taught to hold in contempt. The offensive stalled. Panzer Brigade 113 ceased to exist as a coherent striking force. The men who had rolled off the trains with the paint, barely cured, were dead, burned, captured, or driving the long way around a stretch of open grass because of what waited in the folds of it. Andrew Bruce spent years being told his idea would not survive contact with a real German tank. Contact happened in the fog outside Nancy. The Germans changed their route. That is the answer, and they signed it themselves. In fuel they could not spare, on a road they no longer dared to drive. 25-1. That is the exchange ratio the tank destroyer force closed the war with, the highest of any American armored branch, and it belongs to the machine the Army spent 1942 through 1944 apologizing for. The M18 killed more enemy armor per loss than the Sherman that everyone remembers, and more than any tank the United States put in the field, the Pershing that arrived too late to matter much included. The open-topped, thin-skinned gun carriage that generals wanted canceled ended the war as the deadliest thing on tracks the Army owned. Read the number twice. It does not soften. The 704th alone kept climbing after Arracourt. By the spring drive into Germany, the battalion had a running tally that its own records put past 60 enemy armored vehicles for the campaign, against a fraction of that in Hellcats. The same trick, over and over. Sit still. Let the German come. Fire from the flank. Reverse off the position before the turret finds you. Bruce had drawn it on a chalkboard in Texas and been laughed at by men who outranked him. The men who did the killing never got the chance to laugh back because most of the Army had already decided the concept was a mistake before the shooting confirmed it worked. Here is the irritating part. The Tank Destroyer branch was disbanded in 1946, gone. The doctrine that produced 25-1 was folded up and put away within a year of the surrender it helped win. Judged a wartime improvisation the peacetime Army had no use for. The vehicle that outkilled every tank in the inventory left service faster than the tanks it embarrassed. You can argue the branch had flaws, and it did. It depended on an enemy who attacked into it, and Germany stopped attacking. But the machine did exactly what its designer promised, at a ratio nobody has beaten since, and its reward was the scrap line. Kessler, if the name in the first frame of this was a real Feldwebel and not a stand-in for the hundreds like him, did not need the post-war tables to know it. He had learned it at 40 meters in the fog. Look at what the Germans built and what killed it. The Panther weighed 45 tons, mounted the long 75 that could punch through nearly anything the Allies fielded at a mile, wore sloped frontal armor a Sherman round would skip off. The Hellcat weighed under 20 tons, carried a lighter gun, and had a roof of open sky over the crew's heads. On every specification sheet printed in Berlin, the Panther wins. On the Lorraine Plateau, the specification sheet was aimed that morning at empty grass, while the lighter machine fired from the Germans 4 o'clock and was gone before the Traverse motor caught up. The Reich lost 15 of its best for 3 of America's cheapest and could not explain how. There is a photograph in the after-action file. It shows a Panther near Lizay with a clean penetration through the side of the hull. The metal peeled back where the round went in. The vehicle burned out and settled on its road wheels in a beet field going brown with the season. No dramatic angle, just a dead tank that cost more than the houses its crew grew up in, killed by a machine a third its price, sitting in the mud where it stopped. There is the whole argument in one frame. The men of the 704th went home with that ratio and mostly said little about it. The branch was gone, the vehicle was scrapped, the histories moved on to the tanks with roofs. One veteran of the battalion, asked long after the war what it had felt like to hunt Panthers in a machine everyone said was too fragile to survive, did not talk about fear or armor or the odds on paper. He said they had never worried much about the German tanks being better, because a better tank you cannot see is not better than anything. They just kept moving, and the Germans kept dying, and after a while, the Germans stopped coming down that road at all. Then he shrugged and said, the only thing that ever really mattered out there was who shot first, and they always did.